Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining me for another restful episode of true, scary stories to help you fall asleep. Today, we are going to be reading the most disturbing stories that I could possibly find on Reddit. So, because these stories are so disturbing, I do want to let you know that viewer discretion is strongly advised. If you don't have a very strong stomach, or you don't like some of the more graphic stories, please skip this video, because every story in this video is going to either be graphic or very disturbing in some other way. If you have past traumas or PTSD from certain incidences, please, you might want to skip this one as well. These stories will mention things such as assault, sexual assault, abuse, and much, much more. You have been warned. With that being said, also because of the nature of this video and how disturbing some of these stories can be, this video may potentially get demonetized. I don't know yet because it hasn't been uploaded and YouTube tells me whether they monetize me or not after I upload the video. But anyways, if you would like to support the channel, please consider buying me a coffee. The link to that will be in the description down below. Also, I am on Cameo now as well, so if you would like personalized videos made specifically for you, make sure to go over to Cameo and look up Inner Scare. But anyways, without further ado, lay back, relax, and enjoy these true scary stories. To my ex-best friend of 25 years, let's not meet. I've known this guy my entire life. We'll call him Mr. D. Mr. D is a high school teacher and head of his department. We've known each other since preschool. We grew up a couple of blocks from each other. Every summer growing up, we spent the entire summer walking to each other's houses, having sleepovers, and spending long days playing Zelda, Halo, and other games that we loved. He was kind of a weird nerd, but so was I, and that's why we got along so well. I've always loved him and considered him a brother. After we graduated high school, we went on two separate paths. I got into drugs and partying, and he went to a private Christian college. He worked hard his entire life towards becoming a teacher. By the time we were young adults and I was getting out of the worst of my party phase, he was very professional and put together. He got married to a woman that he met in college and got a good career job. Everything seemed like it was going well for him. His wife seemed like a very normal, well-off professional woman. Something strange happened a few months after he got married. His wife asked if they could have an open marriage. This caused a lot of stress and turmoil in their relationship. His mental state started deteriorating, and they argued back and forth about this for a few years. It was never brought up once before the wedding, and she strangely had a man already picked out that she wanted to hook up with. Last year, his mental health started rapidly declining. He finally agreed to the open marriage. At the time, he got on SSRIs, and he came out as bisexual. I was happy for him. Finally, he could express who he was and be okay with himself. I never would have guessed, after knowing this guy's intimate life details for many years. But I guess you never know, I thought. Stuff has just become strange and worse since then. Significantly worse. He cut off his parents from the time that he came out until last spring, claiming that they were too conservative and Christian. I talked to his parents regularly. Heck, I told him at his wedding they were like second parents to me. This was very traumatic for them. He's their only child, and he had no real reason to cut them off. Stuff has just become worse as time went on. He told me that him and his wife were black magic and witchcraft practitioners, which I always just rolled my eyes at and thought he was a little crazy. This guy, who was always a stand-up professional dude, started acting super degenerate. having multiple relationships with men and women that never lasted longer than a couple of months, and telling everyone he knows explicit details about his sexual life. When asked to turn it down out of the straight-up perverted, disgusting things that he was saying, he started getting in people's faces, mine, saying that this is who he is, this is his identity, and ranting about how his people have been oppressed for years. This past August, he told me and a friend that his wife believes that pedophilia is a sexual orientation and is just as valid as being gay or straight, and that it's harmless. I was shocked, disgusted, and blown away. This guy is a high school teacher, influencing children, and he said this very nonchalantly and casually. Halloween was the peak. The day before Halloween, he came over. It was just supposed to be a few friends, gaming on the Nintendo 64 and smoking a couple of blunts. My friend Mr. D came over before everyone else. Bright rainbow flag colored bag and glitter sparkle nails. "Do you like my bag?" he said. I nodded and agreed. I'm truly not against homosexuality, but this irked me. This is not the same guy that I grew up with at all. But whatever. He's being himself, I guess. Good for him. Before everybody came over, he asked if I planned on drinking. I declined. He asked me to run to the liquor store with him. I said sure and came with. He came back with a liter of Honey Jack. Oh boy, tonight was going to get wild. Over the course of the night, several extremely disturbing things were said. At first, there were comments to a friend. "Hey, Mr. L, meet me in the bathroom. I gotta tell you about my DMT trip." Okay, why do you have to meet in the bathroom? Mr. L never went. We're still confused about this. The more liquor that was drank, the worse it got. No one touched a drop except for Mr. D. I call him Mr. D for Mr. Degenerate. First, he made a comment about my sister. My sister is barely legal, and Mr. D has known her since she was born. I was beyond freaked out, but I decided not to be angry. I had to spend the next 12 or so hours with this guy. It was like 8:30. I'd be angry later. It just kept getting weirder and weirder. At one point, he told us that his wife is a bestiality fetishist. When I said this was wrong, he said, "I'm no stranger to the peanut butter myself." Who knows what that means? I guess we can assume that he isn't going down to the farm. To top the night off, he started talking about his sexual desires for a male student, how he's going to turn him gay. When I told him this was really bad, he said, "He's going to be 18 soon. We'll wait until after graduation to hook up. The district can't do anything about it then." How he failed to see the power play between a student and a teacher, regardless of gender or orientation, is beyond me. This seriously creeped me the heck out. He spent the rest of the night trying to get several friends to let him suck on them. All guys who we've known for 10 to 15 years that have always identified as straight or asexual. He crashed by 12:30. Usually on Halloween, we stayed up watching movies. I'm happy that did not happen. I remember as I was closing up my house for the night, there was a Friday the 13th opening screen on my TV for NES on his RetroPie. I find this pretty symbolic of the death of our friendship. I woke up at 7 a.m. to hear this guy taking care of himself in my apartment. I started coughing loudly and shuffling my blankets so he'd stop. I think he did, but I fell asleep after. Shortly after he left, we got in an argument about COVID, which I believed I had for a few days but did not, and still went out when I thought I had it. I didn't truly think I had it. We didn't talk for a week. I tried contacting him and apologizing. He basically called me a cold-hearted drug addict with no future and a bunch of other stuff. I told him I was worried about him since Halloween, and he's lucky that I don't call his parents and have him institutionalized. He blocked me pretty shortly after this. I honestly never plan on talking to him again. I've known and loved this guy my entire life, but I just can't anymore. Something else interesting happened. He had a friend named Mr. A. They were very close but stopped talking about a year ago when all this stuff started to happen. Mr. D always said that it was because Mr. A was a butthole with no real explanation of events. Something about Mr. D being drunk and taking Mr. A's arm and putting it around a girl. I decided to contact Mr. A and ask the real story. He informed me that Mr. D had sexually traumatized his female friend so bad that she still hasn't fully come back to terms with what happened. And shortly before he told anybody, Mr. D was seen at a gathering telling a group that he was going to get Mr. A so drunk that he could not remember getting effed by Mr. D, or say no. Mr. A is non-binary. I'm not sure if he classifies as straight or homosexual, or something else. But the important part is that he had already told Mr. D on a handful of occasions that they would not be sleeping together. So, Mr. D, let's not ever meet. Not even in passing. I've known and loved you my entire life. But after all this, I have been messily cleaning my house, finding all kinds of random stuff that you've given me over the years, and either tossing, burning, or selling it. By the way, you were talking. I'm sure that you'll be in prison or dead soon. So I wish you a good farewell. It was nice knowing you, but our friendship and brotherhood and time together is up. You traded a normal professional life for degeneracy, bestiality, R-wording, borderline pedo lifestyle. And if you ever talk about my sister like that again, I'll beat your butt. No lies. I've been doing nothing but praying. I haven't prayed since middle school, and racing to delete every trace of you from my life since this incident. My husband and I are expecting our first child, which I knew would be a really sensitive issue, as his own mother died in childbirth with him. We met with a marriage counselor to talk through things at the beginning, and he swears that he's been seeing his own therapist twice a month throughout my pregnancy. I don't want to call him a liar, but I'm fairly sure that he's either not going or talking about the big issue. He and his father, a hugely active part of our lives, are completely convinced that I'm going to die in childbirth. They won't openly admit it, but their behavior has reached the point where it's constantly making me feel stressed and uncomfortable. When it was my husband saying, please make sure your life insurance is up to date, and I'd like to meet with a lawyer and draft a will, I was like, that's kind of intense, but okay if that makes you feel better. When my husband asked me to go through all of my possessions and inventory, what I wanted to be saved for the baby versus what I would want to be returned to my family in the event of my death, I put my foot down and said absolutely not. That's too morbid. No way. My father-in-law, who lives a few blocks away and eats dinner with us 2 to 4 nights a week, got on my case about how I was making things difficult for my husband in the event that he will be a grieving widower with a newborn. I'm just going to add here that I've had a completely complication-free pregnancy and have no reason to think that I will die screaming in the next couple of weeks. When I tell my husband this, he calls me paranoid, but I think my father-in-law wants me to die. His whole family identity for the past 35 years has been the amazing single dad. Never dated or had close friends or even hobbies really. And it seems like he's looking forward to being able to guide my husband through what he went through. At this point, I'd honestly be happy to never see my father-in-law again, and I certainly don't want him in the delivery room, especially since he told me that he was putting his foot down about me not being allowed to have an epidural or laughing gas. He's a commanding presence, and I know that whatever he wants in the delivery room, he will get. I know people will say, oh, labor and delivery nurses would never let that happen, but you haven't met this man. My husband, in addition to backing his dad on everything, acts like my due date is my death date, and has completely pulled away from me. Every minute with him is morbid, stressful, and a reminder that our marriage seems to be crumbling. No matter how many times I tell him his behavior makes me stressed and upset, it's just getting worse, and I do not want it around me while I'm concentrating on giving birth. Do I owe it to my husband to let him stress and upset me during labor? Is this presence at the birth more important than a safe and healthy delivery? My therapist says no, but this whole thing has been so weird. I feel like I need some outside perspective. I'm not a nurse, but I did work for an emergency mental health unit that we'd go and see people in crisis. They define the crisis, not us. People could call up and say, "I don't like my life," or some variation of that, and we'd go out and see them regardless. I worked the late shift. We were a voluntary unit, by which I meant the client that we had to be willing to see us before we came out. That stopped a lot of the "my girlfriend is crazy, come and take her away" calls. Not all of them, but a lot of them. We always went out to see someone in twos, because of safety reasons. And one night, I got a standard kind of call from someone who had a friend that knew this guy that other people were worried about. Usually I'd ask a few questions like, is this person currently attempting to unalive themselves? And do they want to see us? But with this call, I had to do a lot of ferreting around in a confused person's brain to get information. It turns out that the person to be seen is a long-term alcoholic who has a friend that goes shopping for him. For a few months, it's only beer. Cheap beer in 2-liter containers. I'm in Canada, by the way. And because there was no self-unaliving apparent, we weren't going out. Even though the "my girlfriend are crazy" types wants us to be the mental health police, we were quite clear on the need for the client to agree to speak with us. I wanted to go and see what was going on. The guy I was talking to was a drunk as well, so he wasn't being very clear about things. But there was something that made me think we'd better go out to see this guy. After discussing the client and the situation with my compatriots, we figured we'd go out, knock on the door, and see if this guy would be willing to speak to us. We arrived, and were greeted by no less than 8 people. The original caller and his moral backup crew. 2 police cars and an EMT unit, all looking a little anxious. My partner and I girded our mental loins and walked up to find out why there were so many people there. The original caller, oh my god, what a surprise, was not actually the friend of a friend who knows a guy who, etc., but the person who had been buying the beer for our client, whom we still have not seen. As we're standing outside this guy's house getting background information, the wind shifts slightly. This house is close to an arbiter, so I didn't think too much of it at first, until I noticed the cops and paramedics quickly move away from the front of the house we're supposed to be going into. The beer buyer turns a little gray, and his support team quickly fade. He's gone right afterwards. The paramedics are getting ready to go in by slapping on 2 layers of medical gloves and smearing something that looks like Vicks VapoRub on their upper lips. I grew up on a farm and have had to deal with some pretty stinky things, so I figured that I'd be okay. My partner, the senior person in our unit, turns to me and says, "I don't think we can go in there." Great, we're down 1 already, and we haven't even knocked on the door. Official tally, -1. So I knock on the door and hear a weak "come in" after a few seconds. The door's not locked, and I walk into something that is really difficult to describe. The cops are right behind me with the paramedics right behind them. This old guy we're seeing has been a heavy drinking alcoholic for about 30 years, and recently he's been going downhill, quickly. He's been getting his neighbor to buy him groceries and beer for about a year straight. The neighbor must have been feeling small twinges of guilt about the condition of the guy that we're going to see, as well as the fact that he's been stealing the old guy's money by telling him how much more expensive beer is than it used to be. Stuff like that. So the kitchen is piled high, like from the doorway to where I guess the counters were, with bags and bags of rotting food. The neighbor would put the food bags in a clear spot nearest the fridge, and then the next closest, and then the next. The food bags were out the kitchen door, So, piles of rotting meat and vegetables, as well as all the insects, etc., that thrive in conditions like that. Some of the bags were moving. You get the idea. One of the cops turns and walks out at this point. Official tally, -2. To clarify, the house was long and thin, sort of like a trailer that's gone sedentary. The kitchen is off the entranceway to our left, with the living room visible through the open door directly in front. The bathroom is off the living room also to the left, as is the bedroom. The old man was sitting in the living room, at one end of a long couch. We could see the back of his head when we were in the entranceway. A pile of empty 2-liter plastic beer bottles piled high enough beside the right-hand side of the couch that they were higher than the couch, and went from the wall to the couch and over the back of it. I realized later that he'd probably started on the right side of the couch and slowly shifted left over time. I walked around the other side of the couch, glanced into the bathroom, plugged toilet, bathtub about half full of rotting stuff, and I was going to say there was a line of crap from where the old man sat to the toilet, but it would be more correct to say that it was rotting meat and bubbling stuff in the bathtub. When I turned around to start talking to this old guy, I realized that the couch is covered in crap as well. Dry crap. But if Dexter had been around and had been more into crap than blood, he would have loved that couch. Splatter patterns everywhere, including as I realized once my eyes had adjusted to the light in the room, over the top of bottles. There's really not much to say about the old man. Not much of a personality left at this point. He's sitting there still watching TV, oblivious to the fact that 4 strangers have walked into his house. The cop, who is still standing, turns off the TV, and the old guy eventually blinks a bit and comes around. It's my job to talk to him, so I do. While I'm asking him questions like, "What's your name? How old are you? Do you understand why we're here? Are you willing to talk to us, etc.?" There's this other smell that I can't quite place. It's not perfume or anything like that, but the opposite. Something so foul that I want to stop asking about his mental health and ask instead about colognes and why he should never ever wear or drink that kind again. When he shifts slightly in his seat, the combination of the squelching noise and the absence of expression on his face makes me sit back a bit. The paramedics are both standing behind him, and we lose one of the paramedics at this point. Official tally -3. We're down to 50%, Captain. The other paramedic and I met eyes at this point, and we both sort of intuited what we were dealing with here. So, it becomes quickly obvious that the client is not there enough for us to conduct any kind of legitimate interview. So me, the paramedic, and the cop step outside to figure out what the heck to do. At one point in the conversation, the old cop turns to me and asks very seriously, "Do you think there is a possibility of a medical emergency here?" The paramedic who'd stayed and I both burst out laughing, quickly calmed down, and both answered yes. The question wasn't ridiculous, but necessary, because that was the only way that we could legally get the old guy out of there. But under the circumstances, it was pretty clear. To make a longer story shorter, we went back in, told him that we were going to take him into a hospital for his own safety. He was too gone to really understand, until the cop, who was still on his feet, asked him to stand up and grabbed one of his arms to help him. The paramedics didn't move fast enough with their warnings, so as the old man tried to comply, the squelching and the stench hit the cop full on. Now we are at 0 cops, 1 paramedic, and 1 mental health worker. Official tally is at -4. The paramedic goes to get a stretcher, and a quick pep talk with his second, and between the 3 of us we figure out what to do. And now, the payoff. The old guy's been in that one spot long enough that his fecal matter and other excess have more or less melted the fabric and foam that he's been sitting on, and his clothing, skin, back, and thigh flesh have all necrotized, and the rot from that has mixed in with the couch. so that it's hard to tell which is which. There were chunks of bone visible, long strips of rotting flesh in colors that I hope to never see again. And oh my God, the smell of it. One of the paras had a spray can in his hand, and the second the old man got up enough that we could see air between what was probably him and what was probably the couch, he sprayed the couch, not the client, which stopped us from vomiting all over the patient. We lay him down face down on the gurney, or whatever it's properly called. They tossed some gauze over his butt and wheeled him out of there. They didn't even try to separate what was the man from what was couch bits. The paramedic figured he'd been sitting there for at least a month or so. The cops were still outside trying to figure out what they should be doing, and the only thing I could think of was for them to lock up. They did. We left, and I never found out if the client survived or not. But I don't think I'll ever forget the smell or the sight of what was left of him. The worst of all of it, the look in his eyes when I asked him if he understood why we were all here. Hollow, dead flat eyes with someone screaming behind them. That and my partner telling me that I stunk up the van as we drove back. I have no idea how that man could still be alive when he stood up. It looked like half of him had simply rotted off. This happened when I was a newer cop on patrol, long before I became a detective. I was working midnights in a neighborhood with a high violent crime rate, and we got sent to a dispute at a bar. This wasn't just any bar. We always referred to it as the Star Wars Cantina, because it was always a crap show. We stopped a R-word in progress in the dirt alley behind the same bar not long after this. I was working with a female that night. We make our way through the bar, systematically booting people out, and get to the bathrooms. I open the door to the men's room, and it's empty. Single-stall bathrooms. My female partner goes to open the women's bathroom door, but it's locked. She knocks on the door, and a female says, "I'll be out in a minute." We advise her that the bar is closing. Bars close at 4 a.m. in New York. After a couple of minutes, we begin to grow impatient. My female partner knocks on the door again, and the female agrees to open the door. When she comes out, we ask her what took so long. She's not providing any substance in her answers. She's wearing tight yoga pants, and we notice that she has a large bulge in the back of her pants/crotch. We believe that she was either doing drugs in the bathroom and shoved the rest in her pants, or that it was a weapon. When we questioned her about it, she's very evasive and won't answer us. My female partner begins to search her. As she pulls back the female's pants and shines her flashlight down to look, my partner says, "Crap." She sees a baby arm sticking out from the female and up through her butt. This chick has been drinking and smoking crack all day. She had a stillborn and continued to stay at the bar and drink/smoke crack. When the ambulance arrived, they went back to the bathroom with the female and pulled the rest of the baby out of the female and into the toilet bowl. The baby was completely formed, except it had never formed a head. It was just sunken in around the neck. I've seen some crazy stuff in my career like brutal homicides, etc., but that one always stands out the most. So I have 4 kids under 5, 1 set of twins, and all the chaos that goes with them. My 30-year-old #child-free sister used to really lord over me over her Pinterest perfect married with no kids life. The breaking point for me was when she started referring to my house as the farm and our kids as the livestock. She knows that my first and third pregnancies, the twins, were accidents that I did not want and was not ready for. But she still makes fun of me as not knowing where babies come from and telling me to just admit that you love being a breeder. She really had me at the breaking point with all of her comments when we were over at her condo in November. I noticed that she had a box of Nuva rings in the fridge. That's what I used too, and that's when inspiration struck. I took 2 of my Nuva ring sachets and, over the next week, put them for hours in the hot clothes dryer in a delicates bag hooked over the door so it wouldn't tumble around. Then, when I was at her condo again, I swapped hers with my special Let's Make a Baby version. I wasn't sure if it would work, but it was all I could do to keep from laughing out loud when she asked me in December whether I ever had an irregular period on the Nuva ring. She said that her period had started before she removed her ring. That's when I knew my plan might work, and with any luck, she'd be ovulating that month. She asked if I thought she should use condoms. I did my best to play it straight and told her the complete truth, that I was 100% sure that she had nothing to worry about. Of course, I was sure she shouldn't have to worry about having unprotected you-know-what. That is how babies are made, right? Then I slipped in another special Nuva ring in her box next time I was at her house, just in case it took an extra couple of cycles for his swimmers to do their job. Just to be sure, I checked her bathroom drawers to make sure there was no annoying condoms. Sure enough, Little Miss Child Free was doing the baby dance without any protection at all. It was so hard to keep a straight face when I saw her husband give her a pat on the butt and a kiss. I knew they'd been trying to make a baby as soon as we went home. Guess what? Child Free sister is now going to be a mommy. She just told us today. Turns out, she never had another period after the first special Nuva ring. This is going to be so much fun. I'm already planning how to enjoy the next few years. I stood by and allowed my wife to almost kill our son. I was happy that she did it. Okay, fair warning. This one's long. Apologies for that, but this is very hard for me, and I've been carrying it for a lot of years. On the advice of my therapist, I've written it all out to try and work out my feelings on it. He didn't advise me to submit it to Reddit, of course, but I struggled with this for a long time, and I need to hear other people's opinion on it. I still really have no idea how I feel about it, even after all these years, but I will submit for judgment by the masses. I know I did wrong on some things, probably a lot of things. I tried to do my best that I could. My son was very troubled. Very troubled. If you've seen the movie We Need to Talk About Kevin, it'll really help understand what I'm talking about. Because I swear to God, when I watched that film, I thought I was watching a documentary of my life. I felt like the writer must have had cameras hidden in my house. That's how accurate it was. The only difference is that in the movie, the boy appears normal to his father and only reveals his true nature to his mother. With my son, he didn't have that mask. His insane behavior was the same with everyone. From the day he was born, my son just came out wrong. He was planned. My wife and I tried to get pregnant and were ecstatic when he was born. He was wanted and loved. We showered affection on him and really tried to give him a happy childhood. But from the day we brought him home from the hospital, he was miserable. He cried for 13 months straight. I'm not exaggerating. 13 months without a break. He cried until he had no voice left and kept crying still. You could see his little face scrunched up and no sound coming out. Totally hoarse. There were times he would literally be crying in his sleep. I've never seen or heard of any other kid able to do that. We brought him to doctors, specialists, tried changing his diet, held him, rocked him, toys, swaddling, music, mobiles, everything we could think of. Nothing worked. 13 months of grading, grinding, no sleep. Once he got over the crying stage, we thought we were out of the woods. But it quickly became clear that for some unknown reason he was just angry at being alive. I never saw that kid have a genuine joyous smile once in the time that I knew him. I saw him grin a vicious, horrible grin many times. taking a perverse pleasure from causing pain or suffering or breaking a rule. But a smile from real pleasure at something nice? No. Never. Not once. He had no interest in anything positive. He was fueled by hate, and everything he did was bent toward that. As soon as he could walk, his mission in life was to destroy things. He would break or try to break anything that came in his range. Smash it, chew it, throw it in the toilet, whatever he could do. After a while, he figured out how to get his diaper off, and he took great pleasure in crapping and peeing anywhere he could. After a while, he figured out he could hide it, and started peeing and pooping in places where we wouldn't find it right away, grinding it into carpets, making it even more of a problem to clean, and making the house stink. When he got older, ages 9 to 15, he would pee and poop in our bed until we got a lock on our door and he wasn't able to get in anymore. Then he'd just take a dump in the hallway in front of our room. That biological warfare started at around 2.5 years old, and he never grew out of it. I'll try to speed it up as I could literally go on for days about this stuff. But as he grew older, he became more and more unmanageable. He would bite, kick, scream, scratch, and spit at anyone trying to do anything with him. He was kicked out of school twice before he was 9. Then they let him back in, and then kicked him out for good. He had to change schools. The next one put him in a special class that kept him away from other students. We had to install a door and lock on the kitchen because he would steal knives and use them to gouge the walls or furniture, or chase people with them. When he was 10, he stabbed me pretty good in the hip. I still have the scars. As he grew older, he grew darker. He moved into setting things on fire and torturing local animals. There was a stray dog that hung out around the park near our house. My son blinded it in one eye with a barbecue fork. He would dip cats' tails in gasoline and light them on fire. He became a violent, stinking, vicious beast that lived in our house. We couldn't do anything with him. I'll take this opportunity to preempt the tsunami of messages. Yes, we had him in therapy. He saw a psychiatrist twice a week and had God knows how many different medications prescribed to him over the years. Nothing worked. Therapy didn't work. Meds didn't work. Nothing worked. He was like a poison cloud of hate and fury lashing out at anything in his reach. When my son was 16, my wife got pregnant again. I can't tell you how different our reaction was. Instead of joy, we felt horror. This pregnancy had not been planned, and we really were at a loss over what to do. My son had been such an unending nightmare for 16 years. We couldn't take the idea of starting again from the beginning. We talked a lot about terminating, but A, access to abortion was not as easy in those days as it is now, and B, my wife was very against it. We talked about many options. In the end, we decided that my wife would have the baby, and if it turned out evil, we would put it up for adoption. We knew that we just couldn't do it again with another child like our son. We had a daughter. She was normal. Suddenly, we saw what our lives should have been like the whole time. How things would have been if our son had not been himself. She laughed at things. She breastfed without biting. She didn't have teeth yet anyway, but you could tell that she was just trying to eat, not tear her mom's breast off. After 4 months, she was sleeping through the night. She was happy. She was normal. I can't describe the relief and happiness that we both felt. I don't have the words for it. This is where I believe I may have started really pulling back from my son. Up until that time, whatever mistakes I made, I had always tried to do the best for my son. I am convinced of that. I tried to help him and love him and care for him. I really tried. But when my daughter was born, my wife and I both instinctively just turned toward her. She became our focus. Not from malice, but just because she was so much easier. She was so happy and sweet. Every moment with her was like magic. I understand this was wrong, but we honestly couldn't help it. I don't have a better explanation than that. My son hadn't given a crap about my wife being pregnant. I honestly don't know if he really understood it, but when we brought home our daughter, he started acting out even more. I didn't think it was possible, but he took it up another notch. At this time, he was 17, and we were having blowout screaming matches daily. Usually after we fought, he would storm out of the house and disappear for hours at a time, or come back the next morning. It was a relief. I started to actually look forward to our fights because it would get him away from us for a while. After the birth of our daughter, my relationship with my son was almost entirely gone. Our only real interactions were screaming at each other. My wife was even worse with him. She just had nothing left. By that time, if our son even came into the same room as her, she would just stop whatever she was doing and start screaming, "Get away from me! Get away! Get the crap out!" until he left. He started spending more and more time out of the house, which was a blessing for us. I have no idea what he got up to in the world, but we were just happy that it wasn't being inflicted on us. As a consequence of our son's behavior, we had invested heavily in locks around our house. All of the cheap, thin interior doors in our home had been replaced with thick, dense wooden doors that couldn't be kicked through, equipped with keyed locks that my wife and I carried keys to. I know it sounds extreme, but locks and heavy doors were the best way that we had found to create safe spaces from him. And again, before I am inundated with messages, I was not locking my son in rooms like a prisoner. He had free reign of the house and could come and go as he pleased. My wife and I would lock ourselves in rooms to protect ourselves from him. If anything, we were the prisoners in our own home. In the day in question, I had fought with my son in the morning and he had left the house in a rage. My wife and I were enjoying some peace and quiet in the kitchen while our daughter napped in our bedroom. And then my daughter began crying. Any parent who has had young children can tell you, you get used to your child's cries, and you can tell after a while what they need. They cry differently if they're hungry or need changing or are just restless and want to be held. Babies can communicate pretty well before they can speak. This cry was none of those things. This cry was terror. The second we heard it, my wife and I were both up out of our chairs and running to the room. The door was locked, of course, and it took a few seconds to get the right key and get it open. My son was in the room. We lived in a bungalow, and the jerk had climbed in the window to get to her. He was standing over her crib with a steak knife in his hand. I have no idea where he got it. It wasn't one of ours. We controlled our knives very carefully and always kept them in locked drawers. I think that he may have stolen it from one of our neighbors' houses. He had broken her skin twice already, once in the belly area and once on her arm. I could see blood running down. When I entered the room, he was dragging the back of the knife down her face, not cutting, almost tickling her with it, teasing her while she screamed. He looked up at us and smiled. Before I knew what I was doing, I was already moving, running to put myself between them. I didn't think about it. I just moved instinctively. Even with that, my wife got there faster. It was like a movie on fast forward. She got to our son and bashed his hand away, knocking the knife across the room, and then shoved him with her whole body weight, so hard that he flew away from the crib and bounced off the wall. I picked up my daughter and held her while my wife screamed. I could see her shaking, almost convulsing. I can remember the smell of the room, the sound of my daughter screaming and wailing, the look on my son's face as he stood there. Just nothing. Blank. Dead. There was nothing in his eyes. No emotion. He looked like an alien to me. I watched my wife take a step toward him. I could have reached out to stop her, but I didn't. She stepped forward again, very close to him. I could have stopped her again, but I didn't. She waited, looking at him for maybe 3 to 5 seconds without moving. and then she punched him in the face. Now, until this point, you may have been picturing my wife as a typical woman, small frame, dainty, and delicate. This is not the case. My wife does have a small frame, but dainty and delicate she is not. Never has been since I've known her. Since her early teens, my wife has been a boxer. MMA didn't exist back then, but karate and boxing were big in those days, and my wife was a very talented amateur. She was about 130 pounds. She carried a lot of muscle and she knew how to punch. I had 70 pounds on her back then, and I have no doubt that in a real fight between me and her, she could have and would have pounded me flat. Neither of us have ever laid a hand on our son in anger before, but something broke in her that day, and all the years of anger and pain and sorrow and frustration just came pouring out. When she hit him, his head snapped back and blood started pouring out of his nose. He hardly reacted. He just looked at her with this shocked expression, like he didn't know how to process what had just happened. She waited another second, and then she hit him again. I could have reached out and stopped her. I could have dragged her out of the room, taken her away, calmed her. I didn't. I just stood there and watched while she systematically started to pound him to a pulp. Every time he brought his hands to cover one part, she would blast him somewhere else. Body, head, body, head, over and over. He started screaming, crying out, yelling for her to stop. It's the most genuine reaction I'd ever seen him have to anything in his whole life. But she wasn't stopping. I watched her ramping up, hitting harder, faster, working him like a heavy bag. He tried to swing at her and she slipped him easily. She was on autopilot, sinking down into her training. I stood there watching for a minute. Then I turned my back on them and took my daughter out of the room. I brought my daughter to the kitchen and gave her a bath in the sink. I found that he had cut her a third time on the sole of her foot. All the cuts were superficial. I cleaned her up and held her until she calmed. I put polysporin and band-aids on her cuts. In our bedroom, I could hear my son screaming, calling my wife horrible names, telling her that he would cut her head off and F her corpse. After a while, I didn't hear him saying anything anymore. Didn't even hear him crying out. I assumed that he must have been knocked out, but I could still hear her beating him. That went on for a long time, long enough for my daughter to drift off to sleep in my arms. I just sat at the kitchen table waiting for her to finish. Finally, she came out and sat down across from me. Her hands were swollen and red. Her face and arms were splattered with blood. Her chest was heaving. We just stared at each other without saying anything. After a while, I asked her, "Is he dead?" She looked back at me and answered, "I really hope so." I nodded. That was all there was to say about that. I understood how she felt perfectly. I felt the same. I didn't know what to do, so we just sat there waiting silently. Eventually, my wife started crying and went to go take a shower. I just stayed where I was holding our daughter. After a long while, I heard moaning and sobbing coming from our room. It turned out that my son wasn't dead. I went in to see how bad it was, and it was pretty bad. I've never seen a more merciless beating laid onto anyone before or since. He was laying on the floor, rolling around with blood leaking out of his face, lying in a pool of vomit. His nose was squashed flat out across his face. Both of his eyes were completely swollen shut and starting to blacken already. I could see that a couple of his fingers were bent out at weird angles, and he had used the bathroom in his pants. I think he must have been missing teeth, but I couldn't see any on the floor, and I couldn't see inside his mouth. His lips were all puffed up and swollen. From talking to my wife about it later, I know now that she had systematically beaten every part of his body, focusing heavily on his legs. She told me she kicked him in the groin repeatedly until her legs got tired, and had kept beating his body long after he had passed out. When my wife came out of the shower, I still didn't know what to do about our son. I didn't know whether to call the police or an ambulance, take him to the hospital myself. I honestly didn't have any idea what to do. After a while, I realized that I simply didn't care what happened to him anymore, and we decided to just let him live or die on his own. There was an in-law suite in the basement that we had never really used, and my wife and daughter and I just moved down there. We simply ceded the top floor of the house to my son and locked everything else down, separated our lives entirely. There was plenty of food in the upstairs cabinets, enough for a couple of weeks or more. He had a washroom and bedrooms to use. We had a washroom in the basement, a small kitchenette, and a separate entrance, so we just stopped going upstairs. We just decided that we were done with him. I figured we'd let his food run out and see what happened. Over the next week, we could hear him moving around upstairs sometimes. I think he just spent most of his time lying in bed recovering. I went to work, watching on high alert in case he attacked me in the driveway, but he never did. My wife stayed home with our daughter. She was never out of our sight. One night we heard him going ballistic, smashing things and banging. We didn't respond. He never tried to get downstairs or near us though. I think he was afraid that if he got near us again, my wife might finish the job on him. After 3 weeks down in the basement, we hadn't heard anything from up above for a few days, and I ventured upstairs to the main floor of the house. The place was demolished, and there was no sign of my son. He was gone. It took months to repair the damage he had done and get the main floor back to normal again. There was food and crap smeared all over the walls, and broken glasses on the floor, big holes in the drywall. He had ripped the place apart. He tore up the linoleum in a corner of the kitchen and emptied an entire foam fire extinguisher into the living room. I feel thankful that he didn't burn the house down with us in it. I'm honestly not sure why he didn't. The kid wasn't shy about lighting things on fire. After that, I lived in fear every day that he would come back, that he would ambush us out of the blue and try to kill us. We moved house about 3 years later, and I finally stopped being afraid that he would show up again, as now he had no idea where we were. I finally felt safe from him. All this happened a long time ago. My son was born in the spring of 1971. My daughter was born in '88. I'm an old man now. I'll be 70 this year, and my wife passed from cancer in 2016. My daughter is 31 now. I moved in with her and her husband after my wife passed. I've got 2 granddaughters, and they are the joy of my life. I see a therapist a couple times a month to talk about all this. I don't know where my son is. The last time I saw him was when he was lying on the floor of our bedroom, bleeding and smashed. I haven't heard from him since he left, more than 30 years ago now, and I don't want to. I carry a lot of guilt from that time, and a lot of conflicted emotions. I didn't beat him myself, but I allowed him to be beaten, and I thought that he deserved it. I was happy it happened. I didn't try to kill him, but I would have been happy if he died. I will say that I do hope that he was able to overcome his demons and go live a normal life somewhere. If he wasn't able to do that, if he stayed the way he was, then I truly do hope that someone out there killed him. When I knew him, he was a rabid dog, and whichever way it went, I just hope he isn't still out there, hurting anyone else. This is so late that I don't know if it'll be seen, but I'll post anyways. Also using a throwaway because the victim is another Redditor, who could be identified through my normal ID. Back in 1995, I lived in a quiet neighborhood in the San Francisco East Bay with my wife of a few years and our 20-month-old daughter. We had a small 3-bedroom, 2-story house, and one of our second-floor bedrooms doubled as my home office. One quiet Saturday morning, I was in my office playing Command & Conquer on my computer with my headphones on. oblivious of the sounds of the outside world. I'd probably been playing for an hour or so when, during one particularly quiet moment, I faintly heard my wife cry out downstairs. Knowing that she was down there with our daughter, I pulled my headphones off to see if she needed help with anything. Until the day that I take my last breath, I'll never forget what I heard when I pulled them off. I heard the voice of a man with a thick Mexican accent shout, "Quit yelling, or I'll cut your head off and screw your daughter." My daughter was crying hysterically. After that, it was like some switch was thrown in me and my higher brain just shut off. I wasn't making decisions, I just acted. I don't even remember pulling the .45 from the lockbox in my desk. I just remember walking down the stairs slowly, scared that I was going to see my wife dead when I reached the bottom. Instead, when I did reach the bottom, I saw my wife half naked bent over the couch, bleeding from somewhere in her upper body, while being assaulted from behind by some burly guy with a knife in his hand. He wasn't trying to R-word her. He was in the middle of the deed and was probably nearing climax. I never said a word to the guy, not while I was upstairs, not while I was coming down the stairs, and not when I walked into the room. His back was to me, so he had no idea that I was even standing there. He was holding his knife in his right hand, so that was the arm that I grabbed with my left hand when I pulled him off. He spun away from her at me with a confused look on his face, and I shot him square in the chest at nearly point-blank range before he had a chance to say a single word. His face went pale as he went onto one knee, and I fired twice more. One hit his neck and the second missed entirely. I was told later that the first shot was the fatal one. What happens next has always been a point of shame for me. The only thought going through my head at that point was that I couldn't let my daughter watch this man die. Without even checking on my wife, I scooped my daughter up and walked out my front door. As I walked out to my driveway, I saw one of my neighbors standing there staring at my house. He'd heard the gunshots. The poor guy went pale when he saw me walk out, and I vaguely remember asking him to hold my daughter while I went and checked on my wife. The neighbor asked me if I'd shot her, and I told him no, I shot the man who was R-wording her. I didn't realize at the time that I had the guy's blood spray covering half my body, and that I looked like something out of a horror movie. I then handed him my daughter and my gun. I also have no idea why I gave him my gun, and I went back into my house to help my wife. The police and the DA gave me some flack about the exact circumstances of the shooting. One of the detectives told me that it was more of an execution than a defense, but in the end, they declined to pursue any charges. The man who attacked her turned out to be a guy with some serious mental issues who had been previously convicted of 2 violent R-words, one of which was against a 9-year-old girl. Under California's then new 3 strikes law, he'd have gone to prison for life if I hadn't killed him. As for recovery, I like to think that I've recovered from it, but it certainly induced a few behavioral changes. To this day, for example, I can't wear headphones that block out background noise. Even after years of counseling, over-ear and noise-canceling headphones give me panic attacks because I can't hear what's happening around me. I found out later that he'd been R-wording my wife for nearly 10 minutes before I heard him, and that he'd actually told my wife 3 times that he was going to R-word my daughter when he was finished with her. I was sitting 30 feet away and had no idea that it was going on, and that fact has messed with me for years. My wife had a much worse time of it though. In addition to 2 stab wounds in her shoulder and upper arm, and the bruising and injuries from the forceful R-word, she ended up having a mental break and took years to really recover. For the first 6 months, she absolutely could not be in any room by herself. For more than a year, she couldn't be in a house by herself, and she never re-entered the house where this happened. For several years, she'd break out in a sweat when she heard the men with deep Hispanic accents talking, because she'd hear his voice again. Even now, decades later, she'd start shaking if you try to talk to her about it. She's fine in every other sense, but even discussing it freaks her out. thank you so much for listening to all of the stories in this video. I hope you enjoyed them. I also hope that you enjoyed the extra rain at the end. If you like this more disturbing type of video, please let me know in the comments section down below so that I can do more in the future. But anyways, thank you guys so much for watching and listening, and I'll read to you in the next video. Bye-bye now.